but what we're going to do now is we're going to talk first about some of the regulatory issues relating to decentralized elements in clinical trials. So I want to welcome Ditte Zerlang Andersen. Ditte is the EU project manager and special advisor at the Danish Medicines Agency, but she's also got responsibility for project and portfolio management subgroup of the Clinical Trials Coordination Group. So there could be no better person to take us through some of the regulatory issues presented by our decentralized theme. Ditte, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you very much for the invitation today. We are very much looking forward to all the discussion today, and also the opportunity to understand the research environment much better. So I am representing today our recent work that was published in December last year, coming from the European Medicines Regulatory Network. So I'll be starting to explain a little bit who are the European Medicines Regulatory Network, so which regulators has really come together to provide you these recommendations. That ties in with the scope and the outline of the recommendations, so a little bit of background, and then we're going to do a zoom in on specific topics, the clinical trial oversight, a little bit on e-consent, direct-to-patient shipment, and just a little bit on data handling and monitoring. So the European Medicines Regulatory Network builds on three pillars. We have the European Commission, who sets out the legislation. We have the EMA, who coordinates matters on product authorization. And then we have the heads of medicines agency. So the heads of medicines agency coordinate matters between the national medical agencies. And they are representing an ecosystem on the member state level. So that's where you have all the national agencies, where I'm sitting at the Danish National Medicines Agency. And that's then part of an ecosystem in the member states involving all the ethical experts. So I know it's slightly complicated, but we are then organized on the European level into expert groups on functional level, and that's where you're seeing the clinical trial authorization is actually organized under the heads of medicines agency. So that's the CTCG that was just mentioned, and where I'm working through them to head and solve alignments in our clinical trial environment. We had then lots of groups under the EMA working to solve matters on the product authorization. So what we did in this project, it is a little bit of a new way for us to work, was that CTCG reached out across our European network and established a very broad collaboration. So you really get perspectives from the clinical trial authorization perspective, both ethical experts and national competent authorities, and a heavy GCP IVG. So the GCP inspectors also was really very much involved and driving parts of this collaboration. We still made sure to also tie in with the marketing perspective, so we had participants from the Scientific Advice Working Party and all of the data experts as well. We had representatives from the pediatric environment and also patient representatives and healthcare professionals. So it really was a very, very broad collaboration, and we are a little bit proud of that. It's not a usual thing for us. So it was published at the European Commission website under EudraLex Volume 10, but it really is an EMRN document, so to say. Okay, so what you get when you open up the document is two parts. So you have the main part, which is really setting out the direction in which we want to move in the European regulatory network. And then we had to supplement that with an appendix providing member state national provisions, because when we were starting to draw up these recommendations, we were just facing the fact that there are issues where we are not able to harmonize yet due to maybe positions, but also very much national legislations. So that's what you find in this appendix. But the main paper really sets out the general way in which we want to move. So it is, and it's not we're not yet there. It's not the final solution, but it's a very important first step for us to come together as regulatory environment and try to provide you an aligned and harmonized perspective. It will provide also the basis for best practice for us to authorize clinical trials in Europe, and we expect it will be a living document, so it will evolve and update as we are also learning and interacting with all our stakeholders. Okay, so the focus when we set out, and why did we pull out these experts? Well, we did have a very keen focus on what's going on the operational level, and that's why I'm also so excited to engage and understand the research perspective today, because that's really where we saw the biggest change. So we have this usual environment where the patient or participant is coming into the clinical trial site, having on-site interaction with the medical doctor. And that now changes a lot in the operational setting, where you get lots of opportunities for the patients, much more flexibility to participate in a clinical trial at home, being much more connected with the investigator through technical and innovative platforms. And we are then talking about home health visits and shipping the study drugs home to the patients, and picking up electronic informed consents. So a much more electronic environment. So when we introduce new methodologies, there will always be opportunities and challenges. And that's also why I like the title of today so much. So that's also, you can say, our perspective when we go in and draw up a regulation. So the reason we came together to make this effort was that we want to do our job as best we can to support the harvesting of all the opportunities in this field. But when we are regulators, it is also our job to make sure that we cover the challenges. So when we are drawing up a recommendation, that's what we are doing. We are taking a look at, okay, what are then the challenges in the environment? How do we see ideas and suggestions, recommendations on how to manage and mitigate those challenges? And so that's what you're finding in the framework in the recommendation paper. So the perspectives from our task force was to say, okay, what's important for us when we start our discussions? Well, the key for us to mitigate and manage the challenges was to have a keen view on trial participant-centered and a risk-based approach, to make sure we have investigator and sponsor oversight maintained in the studies, and to have, of course, reliable and robust data that are fit for purpose and can be used afterwards. So that's the thinking we took with us into drawing up this work. So you're finding these chapters in the recommendation paper. There are general considerations, also with a lot of information in there, I'll say, but then an in-depth perspective on the clinical trial oversight, informed consent, deliverable of medicinal products at home, procedures at home, and then something about source data and trial monitoring. So I'll try to go a little bit into the first topics and then very lightly on the last ones. So maintaining the clinical trial oversight was really one of the key issues for us. That's where we saw you can say, the biggest challenge. So we are imagining we are having fewer on-site visits, more involvement of service providers, so more stakeholders means usually more complexity, more use of electronic systems, and that all sort of comes together with an increased amount of incoming data. So from wearables, from home nursing and patient-reported outcomes. So it probably means that in these trials, we'll see more delegation of tasks to service providers and so on, but where the responsibilities really remains the same. So either with the investigator or with the sponsor. So we could stay with this sentence where we say, okay, we have to make sure that when we are doing a decentralized trial, sponsor and investigator are still able to maintain and keep the oversight of the trial participants' safety and well-being. So that's on the very, very high level, but we did then think, okay, what could we imagine to support this? So we have two topics in here. This one is on maintaining clear roles and responsibilities in the trial. So we would say recommend to really document carefully which tasks are conducted at what place, when, and by whom, and how do you see the oversight being maintained. Then also we are recommending a clear communication plan, so you are sure that all involved parties always are updated with the most recent information. And then also making sure that the participants also understand the information flow in the system so that they know what happens to their data. Are there an investigator looking at the data at what time points and so on, so that they really understand also when and how to make contact for acute safety concerns, device malfunctions, or any other questions. So we are not leaving, you can say, the participants a little bit behind at home. So we are really recommending here to make sure that when you're designing your study, you are including patients and investigators. And of course, if you're coming from a research perspective, that's where we are we feel very assured from the regulatory side that you have thought about all the infrastructure. But so it really is, the key for us to make sure that the investigator oversight is maintained in these studies. Then also, all of this data, all of this increased amount of data is also something we are seeing challenging the oversight a little bit on all the data that's coming in and maintaining the investigator oversight. Of course, digital tools always have to be validated and fit for purpose, but also with proper training for all users, so both participants, investigators, trial sites, personnel, and service providers. Then also just the only level we can say is to make sure that you have procedures in place to handle all the information flow and help the investigators really do as easy as possible an oversight of the data. So we really also recommend the use of data flow diagrams in the protocols to help all parties understand the flow of data in the trial. And then take a look at your design during the process afterwards and try to anticipate, so where are the critical safety data coming from? Because often we are sampling a lot of data, some might a little bit duplicate, so where are the critical safety data coming in? Because that's where you then set in with a risk-based approach and make sure you have robust risk mitigation plans and also for device malfunctions and so on. Okay, so then I have a little bit on the informed consent process, but you'll hear much more from Hilde later. So I'll say we were really challenged from the regulatory side to pull up recommendations on this subject because it is such a heterogeneous topic. So there is many forms and shapes. So we put it into three sort of topics and said, okay, there's the interview, which can be remote video or physical on-site. There's the leaflet informing the patient that can be paper, digital, or video. And then you have the signature that can be electronic or wet ink by post. And probably more opportunities that we'll hear about. So I think the main message from us really was to say, okay, you are the experts, so we rely on you to tailor the process in the best way to your patient population. And really figure out what works because something that might work in one population might not work in another population, also might depend on graphics and so on. So just make sure that the trial participants are really fully informed and able to ask questions, so on this very high level, and then really very carefully explain step by step what you want to do in the protocol so we have your thinking behind the process. Then I'll say, from our perspective, this was a very strong ethical perspective as well. The general thinking from our side is that this process does include a face-to-face physical meeting between the participant and the investigator to make sure you can really evaluate eligibility and make sure the participants are fully informed. But of course, there might be cases where a fully remote setting is justified. So that's just where you have to really explain the thinking of why you think a fully decentralized approach is appropriate. So then just a few points on the information leaflet and signatures. So of course, focus on awareness of participants who might not be able to or prefer not to use electronic devices. And then also make sure that the site agrees to really use and store electronic records. So that's a careful GCP note there. Then you have the trial participants also have to be able to retrieve the information they have signed at any given moment in the process. So this is very high level, and I'll say we just had a whole guideline coming out from the GCP Inspectors Working Party on electronic systems. So just take a much more in-depth look at this one for more details. So then a little bit on deliverable of medical products at home. Well, the basic principle we came down to was really that however you want to move it, again, there's a lot of possibilities. You can ship it from the sponsor site to the participant. You can send it from the pharmacy or the trial site to the participant, or the participant might go to a local pharmacy to retrieve it. So lots of opportunities for participants to ease their access to the study drug. So what we say is the investigator has to be the one that requests and initiate the shipment to make sure that the proper drug is authorized. And then, of course, just again, your reflections on why is it feasible in terms of storage, administration, procedures at home, and of course a keen focus on restricting access to the participants' contact details. So it's only on a necessary basis. But I do have to say that this area, I mean, we really support from the regulatory side all the possibilities that's offered here. But this really is one of the places where we are having lots of national issues with another legislation. So it's the pharma legislations on national level, which is preventing. So I don't want to go into details, but everything about the medical shipment is on the top rows. And you see this is where we really have lots of red colors. So there are a lot of things that are not possible at the moment, but now at least we have the map in Europe, and we are trying to change some of those things on national level. Of course, not happening overnight. So then we come down to participants have received that study drug at home, and then what happens with all the procedures taking place at home. Again, there are so many scenarios, and we are really asking your reflections and just think about what's feasible, what makes sense. This is where the trial site and investigator perspective really has a heavy weight. For us, qualified personnel, of course, have to have the adequate training, and then also just reflect on what does it mean for this trial population with decreased on-site visits for the investigator and the participant. And also have a focus on, is there a wish for the participants to come and meet the investigator, or do they prefer to do everything from home? Okay, so just the last topics, I'll go very briefly. So we also have something in there about how you define and handle your source data. So again, the principles are really the same as in any other trials. So they have to be credible, reliable, and verifiable according to the ICH E6. So the only reason we have something in there is that we probably have an increased amount of data that's captured directly from and outside the trial site. So just go in there and look in the recommendation paper if you want more. And then in terms, because we had a lot of new documents coming out also since we published, so we just draw up this list of documents that will help you on more detailed data source handling at the trial site. Okay. So also on trial monitoring, we kept the paper very, very high level because we knew that the GCP inspectors were working on a more detailed Q&A that came out this spring, so you have that reference at the bottom there. The principle here really is also necessity and proportionality in your monitoring strategy, so tailoring, of course, to the need, and then we have really put a high emphasis on not overdue burden to the trial sites. So that's also important for you as a research environment to know that it has to be proportional, and it should not be a burden to you to do remote monitoring. So this is coming up to my last slides, a little bit on the general considerations from our paper. So this sentence I have above is just one of the really important messages from the ethical environment. So that general medical rules to protect trial participants' safety should be upheld, in particular when patients are separated from the traditional care centers. So it's just so that you know that this is the concern that's coming from there. So just make sure that you address it in your protocol when you are tailoring and describing your study, and really also provide us with this trial-specific rationale. Because a lot of the things probably make sense if in your study, we just have to understand why, and so just explain to us all your thinking in terms of the trial population, risks for the products, safety efficacy profile, and so on. And then we are really recommending to involve participants and the research environment, investigators in the design of the study, because, investigators, you are really the one who knows what is feasible, what is okay, and what is maybe not. So the next steps from us, we are at the moment working to implement these recommendations also in our own environment. As you saw, our environment is also slightly complicated, so it will be implemented as the best practice for our trial authorization. So we also did publish just a one-page letter in Lancet. We were very much naive, but giving us the visibility to the research environment. And we will be updating our national provisions overview on a regular basis to help facilitate the member state understanding. And then we'll go out and share experiences so that we are ready to do the next update of the paper. So just at the end, you're not supposed to read this. It's just to show you that we are transparent on all the participants that have participated in this task force to really pull the paper together. I was in charge of project management with my colleagues Stina Löfling from Sweden, and Monique Al and Solange Levison drew the scientific coordination of the paper and all the drafting. But you see here the big part of experts contributing. And it was endorsed on the EU level by both the GCP Inspectors Working Group and the CTCG, so all member states really has committed to this work. So just thank you very much for your attention, and looking very much forward to questions throughout the day.
Thank you so much, Ditte. And if you are watching online, hello again. If you're watching online, do please submit your questions, which will magically come through to me via one of our colleagues in the room. Well, I'll take some questions from the room in a moment. Ditte, you stress there investigator oversight, but does this restrict decentralized trials to areas with adequate broadband? And does that mean that in thinking about equity and some of the issues, for instance, think of a disease that's particularly associated with deprivation, COPD would be a good example. Are you sure that with decentralized trials that you're going to be able to capture the true population affected if investigator oversight is going to be dependent on broadband, which may not be taken up where there are, data restrictions, for instance, and income restrictions?
Well, it's a great question. I don't think that it's going to limit. We are just saying that you have to make sure that it's taken care of, and I think that the problem can be solved in many ways. Just have to think about how to do it. So make sure that the investigator knows what is going on at the patient's home. And I think that we can't get around that because we also cannot leave the patients at home without being properly monitored. So we have to solve it. There are many, many possibilities, and I think that we can tailor them to the specific trial population. So that's also just why we can't cut everything in one piece and say this is how we are implementing decentralized trials, because it will be different. And perhaps for some populations, you know, the risk-benefit will be much more favorable in one direction than in another direction.
Questions from our audience? Sir, I'm going to come down here to you.
Good morning. Marek Migdal, I'm a pediatrician. I'm director of Children's Memorial Health Institute in Warsaw. I am also the member of the PDCO. Thank you very much for this very clear presentation. But I think that talking about these decentralized clinical trials, we must also remember about our experience with telemedicine during the COVID pandemic period. We know that thanks to COVID, this is probably one benefit of COVID, the telemedicine, at least in Poland, enormously raised, and it was a real good chance to get a contact for patients with the physicians, especially primary care physicians. But after these 2 years of COVID, we know that it's risky if there's a first contact of the patient with the physician is much better for continuation of the care. So, especially for pediatric population, thank you for this, your last slide, that it will be depending on the type of the disease and the type of the patients planned to be enrolled into clinical trials. I think that for the first period of this new concept, we will be rather looking, at least in pediatrics, for the hybrid. So we must to get the first contact physically, and later, for continuation, for the purpose of the clinical trial, we can get some visits at home using the telemedicine. So just as I said, this is our experience from the COVID. The telemedicine is very positive tool, but with some limitations.
Ditte, before you answer that, I'm just going to take a poll in the room. How many of you think that with decentralized trials, there should be at least one face-to-face visit, possibly the first one?
Oh,
That's
thank
quite
you very
substantial.
much. And thank
That's
you.
quite a substantial number for those of you online, of those in the audience.
Thank you so much for that poll as well, because we also, and thank you for the comment, because I think I had it up there as a sentence, but I did not mention it. We are really also saying that remember that the e-consent or the consent procedure is not just a signature. Yeah, it is much, much more than that, and it is really the place where you are establishing the relationship between the patient and the investigator as the first time. And that is also the basis of why we are saying we really see this as a physical need. So we want to be pragmatic and open, but just really explain us why in this trial it's not necessary. So full agreement, and really happy to that was such a great support for that point.
Harry or Christine, any comments online that you want to bring to us?
So we have a lot of questions, but the first one was related to the group, the regulatory group, and whether they are trying to approach the EU legislator to reach a common approach in the EU to support all components and to remain competitive with the US, where decentralized trials are on the rise.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So our regulatory system is a little bit complicated, but the CTCG really is the EU body for clinical trial authorization. So the CTCG is the place where we are aligning our positions from a clinical trial perspective. And when we have then breached across to our colleagues from the GCP Inspectors Working Group and the Marketing Authorization Group and a little bit the pediatrics, so we will still evolve that collaboration and do it even better. But we did do a very broad collaboration in this project, and we have, and actually I'll say we did also managed to publish just before the FDA, and we will also hope to engage with them and involve together. Yeah.
Do you think that we're in a more fluid regulatory environment? I mean, COVID really showed us what regulation could do and how it could perform, and this might be another benefit of COVID, but it also showed that flexibility, how important that is. And here you're faced with something with decentralized trials where you need to be flexible because one size just can't fit all.
Yeah, you're totally right. And I agree. I think we are in a much more fluid environment. And also, as I will say, from the regulatory EU perspective, COVID actually helped us to come closer because we are much more used to working in a decentralized way as well. So it will help a lot. And we have the ACT-EU initiative, which actually, this was published under the ACT-EU initiatives, and that initiative will bring us much more closer together.
Of course, the bad news about COVID was that everybody now thinks that regulators can do it in a week. Instead of years. Yeah. Christine, what else have we got?
So we have another question related to informed consent and whether you work closely with the ethics committee and how do you see their readiness and education needs on the topic?
Oh, great question. Yes, we are working very closely with the ethical committees. So we did have ethical representatives on there, and we did also involve the clinical trial expert group. So that's under the commission. It's at the moment the only place where we have central ethical representation. So it is one of our challenges in our environment, how to reach the ethical environment, because to be honest, having maybe some member states have 50 ethical committees in a member state, right? Just imagine how you align perspectives in your own country and then across member states. So it is a challenge, it's something we're working on, and there is something coming to organize also ethical much better on the EU level.
I was actually just going to ask Hilda, who's going to speak to us later about e-consent, about the technology involved in this work and whether there's a standardization required there, because I think I'm right in saying that there's a standardization for Bluetooth, so that all, if you have a blood pressure monitor and a glucose monitor, they can all talk to each other. But how much standardization of the technology is required to make this possible?
An excellent question, and I will a little bit talk about that in my talk, but maybe not necessarily on the technology. I see much more on harmonization, on terminologies, on processes and all that kind of thing, much more, because on technology for me it's e-consent is pretty similar on one hand like EDC or ePro or whatever kind of system, but on process level there a huge harmonization needs to take place.
More about the kind of devices and things that people are increasingly going to be using at home. How much standardization is required amongst those devices?
Yeah, but the devices, e-consent is for me honestly exactly the same as a consent process, where you use digital features on top of it. If you indeed say, like for example on, and that are elements, because some devices, if you say they want to use it on bring your own device, the patient his own device, then of course there might be some restrictions that because if the patient has a very small device and so on, that it's not easily readable, which is of course evident on one hand, and that's why you often, also on e-consent, still need to have the backup process for a paper consent, 100%. Yeah.
Okay, well, we look forward to your talk later on. What else is coming to us from our online audience, who, by the way, are all over the world? Kenya, we've got the Dominican Republic. Hello to you. Christine.
So we have just a question related to the next update of the decentralized recommendation and the issue that you will be tackling. If you have an idea.
Yeah, thank you. So at the moment, we are working to also implement in our own environment, as was also pointed out, that's really important. And then we see the process that now, I mean, this was the first step for us. Now we have to learn, we have to pick up experiences also in our procedures. So we see, let's wait at least a year, maybe more. And then I think the environment will be more ready and will take more stakeholder engagement and take the next step. Yeah.
Sir. And by the way, I take my hat off to you for the number of acronyms you're able to.
Sorry.
I think we do need a glossary of acronyms, don't we?
I hope it wasn't
in this area.
Hello, good morning. José Alves from Lisbon, Portugal. Two questions back to back. First of all, how do you plan to relate to countries which do not fall into the EU jurisdiction? And I'm not talking about the US, I'm talking about countries which are a lot closer to us. UK, for starters, could be a good example.
Naughty step still.
And the second thing is, would you consider a multi-country trial where some centers would be decentralized and others wouldn't? Because that sort of can skew the data.
And actually, that's increasingly important in rare disease.
Yeah, thank you very much. So on the close to us countries, I mean, yeah, we are just at the moment we are not really able to collaborate with our British colleagues, which is a great pity.
We're secret collaborators. Yeah. Secret collaboration.
Well, we are missing them a lot in our collaboration. We hope that it will also be expanded in due time. But we know them very well, and I know that they are very flexible and open-minded, so I'm quite sure that if we can move Europe, I mean, we will also have the British colleagues in. And then you had the question on, okay, I just slipped, can you just repeat?
Where you're having multi...
Yeah, sorry, thanks. It was such a great question because I did not put it in, but in our general consideration, we do have one paragraph on use of data for marketing authorization. So, because our involvement with those regulators were a little bit light, but we did manage to pull in perspectives. And the topic you are mentioning there is one of them. So we want, from the clinical trial authorization perspective and ethical perspective, to have full flexibility for trial participants. So they could, you can say, choose a la carte, what do they want, what do they not want, have trial sites be some on-site, some not. But we also have to admit that it will affect the data, right? So I think the only thing we can say is make sure you do the thinking on how it will affect your data, because maybe for some data points, that's okay. Maybe for other data points, that's more sensible. And so you have to also do a scientific advice procedure, so use the advice opportunities that are up front, do the thinking, your reflections, and ask the regulators what they think about it before you do it, because you're right, it will also impact your data. Yeah.
And do you see that happening more in some areas like cell and gene therapy, where you have few numbers but spread over very many countries?
I mean, could imagine lots of opportunities. So rare diseases is a very, I think, opportune area where you have patients located very dispersed. But this question was also when you had then some sites that were on site, and I mean, we can't really imagine. There are so many scenarios and so many possibilities, and yeah, we have to tailor it.
Thank you so much. Actually, I'm just going to do another poll with our audience, because I'm very aware that actually, were it not for COVID, perhaps we wouldn't be discussing this theme. I mean, it really has made a difference. How many think that COVID has really put decentralized trials up the agenda? Yes, virtually all of our audience. I mean, it's made a huge difference, because I suspect that if we'd been having this conversation 4 years ago, we would have just said, well, it's just not possible, people won't do it. And now all of us are doing complicated laboratory testing at home with our COVID testing. We're doing all sorts of stuff at home that we never thought we would.
You're completely right. I mean, we were discussing the subject, I would say, before COVID actually, and we had a national Danish guideline or recommendations out in 2020. So it's not like it was invented by COVID, but you're completely right. It was accelerated. I think we all learned a lot, as was also just pointed out, what works, what doesn't work. So I think it's been a great, actually, help for us to learn and get that first step much more right that we would have otherwise.
Well, thank you very much, Ditte.